Hi, and welcome back to Kachi Bachi. This is part 3 of a 4-part series on binding your quilt. Today we are actually going to take the bindings that we've made and apply it to our quilt. The very first thing that I need is a sewing machine in good working order, and then I personally use a 1/4 inch foot, so it's a foot with a guide on the side. I'm not going to be using it for 1/4 inch necessarily, but I use that guide to help me keep a very even stitch and seam allowance, because this is one place where you'll actually see that. So today I'm going to be stitching my quilt to the back. If you plan to hand bind, then you would stitch your binding to the front of your quilt, and you would then flip it to the back and hand sew it. For most of my quilts, I do a machine stitched binding, and it's only for people that I love very much that I will do a hand stitch. The other thing I consider in that is the durability. So if I know that it's like a baby blanket and it's going to get washed 500 times, I'm going to machine stitch it just because it's going to be that much more durable. I will leave myself a tail. There are certain tools that you can use where you mark and measure and leave a certain amount of a tail. This is a 2-inch binding. That doesn't work with most of those tools, so I'm going to show you the traditional way of joining it, or at least the way that I join mine. I personally start close-ish to the corner, so I'm going to start right about here in relation to my corner. That allows me to turn my corner, sew down a little bit, and then still have a gap. It's really just a mental thing for me. That way when I know I turn that last corner, then I'm almost done with my binding. I will sew with my needle stopping in the down position because there's a lot of weight, again, working against me, and I don't want to end up with a weird stitch where I stopped and my quilt pulled my fabric out from under my needle. So I do a couple test sews actually, so I can make sure that my seam allowance is going to be the right size. What I'm doing here is I sewed a little bit. I'm going to take and press this over and see if it cuts off my point. And you can actually see that that 1/4 inch is right at the point of my point there. So I should be able to nail that when I flip it. So we're going to actually stitch right around there. To change that, you could increase or decrease the width of your seam allowance here, and that would then increase or decrease the amount of fabric that then folds to this other side. But that is going to nail it for me. Now we stitch, and I will show you what to do when we get to my first corner. So while light is really great for me as a seamstress, apparently with all of these reflective surfaces, it's really sucky for video. So we turned off our light, and now you have a better view of what's happening here. Okay, so as I approach this corner, in order to make this turn, I will actually take and fold my binding back so that the point of that fold lines up with the corner of my quilt. I also want this fold here to be parallel to that raw edge. So if I angle it like that, even though that corner lines up, this is not parallel, and that will make your life harder when you actually go to stitch it on the other side. So I'm going to fold that back. What I'm doing is I'm putting in a crease. So I personally just finger press, which is what I'm doing here. That puts a crease in my fabric. You can also do that and then mark it. So if it's easier for you to see, you can take and draw a line on that crease. And what this is really doing is I'm going to then have a stop, and I'm going to stop sewing with my needle stopping on that green line, and you can backstitch if you so please. So you can see that my thread stopped just shy of that green line. So now that I've sewn up to that line, we're actually going to make our turn. And this corner is the reason that we squared up our quilt. If this were at any sort of an angle other than that 90 degree, you will not get sharp, crisp corners when you turn it. So I'm going to fold that back in the same way that we did the first time when I marked it. And so it's a 45 degree here because that point goes all the way to that corner, and then this runs parallel to my binding there. The next thing I'm going to do is fold this down, and I want that fold lined up with that top edge of my quilt, and then I also want this to be even here. So if you have that top edge but this is going at an angle in one direction or the other, it's not going to turn well if you have that not parallel with that first layer. So I have this, again, my raw edges lined up with the raw edge of my quilt. I have that top fold. I'm going to take this and fold this back and crease it just like we did on the other side. Then draw my line. So I'm drawing a line in that crease. You don't have to draw the line, but it gives you guys a visual here. If it's easier for you to see by drawing the line, it takes 2 seconds. So I'm going to start sewing by dropping my needle in the fabric at that line and then continue down this side. There we go. And you can backstitch if you like. Something that we didn't do, and I typically don't do it when I have a binding that's made from backings, because those backing strips are pretty much the length of the quilt. I can rest assured that these seams aren't going to land in that corner because they're offset from the length of my quilt. If I had made my binding from 42-inch wide fabric, I would start roughly by just laying my quilt on the floor and putting my end of my fabric approximately where it would begin, and then running my binding along the edge of my quilt and seeing if this seam would end up in any of my 4 corners. If this seam is in your 4 corners in any of those places, then it's worth shifting the binding in one direction or the other so that that seam does not land in a corner. It will never make as clean of a binding or as nice of a turn if you have a seam on the corner. The other thing I will say is I have a small extension table on my machine. If you have an accessory tray or something that you have to extend that throat of your machine out the front, that does make this process a good bit easier. Okay, so this is where I began. This is where I'm going to stop. This is probably about 8 inches. We can tell in a second. I backstitched when I stopped, just for good measure on this. So I left myself, let's see, yeah, an 8-inch gap there. If you're worried about it, err on the side of too wide as opposed to too narrow. The thing that I'm going to do is crisscross my binding strips. So I want to make sure that I have enough tail. I can actually reach all the way to that seam. So wherever I would cut this in here, I would be safe. I'm going to just choose probably about here. That gives me like about a 5-inch tail here and a 3-inch roughly gap. So I'm just cutting that off as square as you can get it. It doesn't have to be a perfect 90 degree. But what I'm going to do here is open up that strip that I cut off. Whatever the width of this strip is how much I need to crisscross or overlap my binding strips here. So I'm going to lay my binding strip where it is parallel with that edge of the cut I made on my first binding. Now I'm going to take my other binding strip, and the most important thing here is that all of this is completely flat. So if it's easier for you to take that to a cutting table or some flat surface to do that, do so. But I want all of this to be nice and flat. So I'm overlapping that binding on the top here, and I'm going to come and cut off. We'll try and make a left-handed cut for you guys. I'm going to cut off this top strip of my binding parallel to the edge of my strip that I have opened up here. So that cut, as you can see, that's the exact width of that strip there. So this is the extra of my binding strip here. That can go into your scrap pile from here because I won't be needing that. So now this is the trickier part for most people. And I can't say that I haven't had to re-sew it myself if you get it going the wrong way. So it can be a little tricky. I will open that. I will open this, and then I'm going to flip to my left and line up right sides together. And I will line up the edge that I cut there with this edge that I cut here. We will take and draw a line from corner point to corner point. I'm going to line that corner with this corner and draw myself my stitch line. So I'm going to go over this quite a few times so I have a very, very solid line so I know which one is my stitch line. I want to make sure I maintain pressure on this because I don't want to lose that alignment. Okay. So now I'm going to stitch on that diagonal. Okay. From here, I will come back and I'm going to cut off roughly 1/4 of an inch from that seam. And then, as we can see, that pops right into place there. So the last thing I'm going to do is open this up and finger press that open. There we have it. So now all that remains is to sew that last little bit of my 1/4 inch here. I start back just a few stitches in my quilt, and that ensures that my seam is nice and solid and it's not going to come out. And there we have it. That is the final seam to close up my binding strips, and there's no excess, and I'll get a really nice clean finished edge when I go to flip this over. You would not be able to tell where I started or where I stopped, and that's always my end goal. Alrighty, so we have this all stitched around our quilt. The only other tip that I'll offer you is if you have a walking foot, that has a 1/4 inch guide, you could absolutely use it for this process. If you have it, it can't hurt to use it. If you don't have it, then hopefully you should be okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope that you learned something. I hope you get really sharp, crisp corners on your bindings and that you can get a perfectly smooth finish when you go to join that last seam. If you have any questions, just shoot us a message in the comments. We would be happy to answer them for you. We look forward to next time, where we're going to go through the 3 main ways that you can actually flip this over and finish off your binding. So until then, happy sewing!